The first bits of world building in your story are often going to be a rather complicated thing to manage. I was just taking a peek at the first couple chapters of my first novel and rereading and relooking over some of the Fellowship of the Ring and how Tolkien handles that in his first chapter. And it's a rather interesting and unique thing. In a lot of ways, in fantasy and science fiction, people are often thrown into the deep end, which is, I think, one fairly good approach. When I was reading the first of the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, the first kind of prologue chapter, I know there's like 3 in that book, but the first one really does throw you into the deep end. You're in a time period thousands of years before the actual story starts, and you're kind of getting into things. And I think that really helps. I think the beginning of the first Star Wars movie does a good job of that too, when the Corvette cruiser goes by and then you get the Star Destroyer coming by over top of it. Not to mention just the practical effects that made that so stunning when it was first aired. But another one of the really common approaches is to just introduce normal daily life. And I think this is done for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of tells you what normal is in that world, which then, of course, gives you something fun to play with when you start to upset the normal. I think on another side of things, you can give the reader an understanding of what is worth fighting for, what's worth saving. And I think in large part, that's what Tolkien is doing in his first chapter. It's kind of difficult when you're reading Fellowship of the Ring to function under the assumption that the reader hasn't also read The Hobbit. But I'm trying as I go through on this pass to actually think about that. And if you don't know much about The Hobbit, it seems to indicate right off the bat that Bilbo is probably going to be our main character. We get some comments about Frodo moving in with him and whatnot, but the first chapter is a long expected party, and it kind of seems to be wrapping around Bilbo. That aside, the first pieces of world building to me really seem to happen right before we get into the inn with Sam Gamgee's father kind of talking to some of the other people about this party that's coming up. Preceding this, we get a comment about Bilbo's age, about the fact that he's turning 111. And we get a parenthetical statement about the old Took, who had been 130. And so we get kind of this very, very subtle component of like, hey, hobbits live longer than humans. It's not really something that's going to be interesting or grab you necessarily. And the next scene, we're just in an inn. We're hearing what sounds like normal old dudes talking to one another after a hard day's work about what's going on and gossiping, and somebody's throwing comments out about, I hear everything is just tunnels underneath the hill there where Bilbo has inexhaustible wealth and he's stashed all kinds of jewels and things that he brought home. And most of that, to me, just serves to say that the Shire is just not that different from a piece of the old British countryside. It's quaint. The concerns of the people there are small. They're worried about small town gossip and a party that's coming out. And yes, it's going to be a big party, but it's pretty subtle. And so this is kind of an interesting thing to think about and to wrap your head around for your own writing, is that the world building that Tolkien chooses to give us like right off the bat is pretty simple. And I think perhaps his purpose in this throughout the entirety of the story is to prove to us that the Shire is worth saving. It also serves to kind of bolster the fact that Frodo, who's going to go on this journey, is kind of just a normal dude that lives in a pretty normal chunk of the world. And so it makes his dedication to the journey all that more heroic. But it also just tells us that we're not all that different from the characters we're reading about. And again, this is just one of many approaches that you can take when you're kind of starting off with your world building. In my fantasy novel, I take a similar approach. The characters kind of start in a little border town. They're on a pit stop running a wagon caravan. And things kind of come up, and there's some talk about maybe we shouldn't go because, there's been some things happening out in the desert. And of course, at the end of the chapter, they decide they're going to go ahead and they're going to move forward. And I'm working on just slowly introducing pieces of that world that are different from our own. But I also have a whole bunch of time talking about making coffee and eating breakfast and things that we can relate to. It's really easy to empathize. And I'm going to try to just slowly introduce these world building elements as I move through that novel. I mean, of course, I've already done it. I'm working on the second draft now, but I think that I probably need to be a little bit more deliberate. And as I continue to kind of pull apart Tolkien's work, kind of coming at it more from a writer's angle on this pass, it'll be interesting to see what pieces we get there, because as soon as we're out of the Shire, I think the world building is going to kind of explode. In fact, before that, it's going to explode when we're in the chapter called Shadows of the Past, if I'm not mistaken, where we get the story of the history of the ring. There is a ludicrous amount of world building that's dropped in there. That'll be an interesting one to take a peek at, because modern authors seem to shy away from things like that. It's now called info dumping, right? Where you're just going to be like, hey, sit down for 6 pages and we're going to tell you thousands of years of history. So I'm intrigued to kind of get into that as a more modern writer and see what he's doing, and the fact that he's not just giving us paragraphs, he's doing it largely through dialogue. But for now, I just kind of wanted to take a moment and talk about what is the purpose of the world building at the beginning of a novel, at the beginning of your novel. And so I hope that as you kind of dive into the beginning of your novel, or just editing it, or even just thinking about the choices you've already made, try to think about that purpose. Is the purpose of your world building in that first chapter or two to just throw your characters and your reader into the deep end? Or is it to show what's worth defending, what's worth fighting for in this particular world? Or is it to just let the reader empathize with people that are in a world that is going to turn out to be very, very different from our own, but we're going to start in a really mundane place? But how does the world building start in your novel? If you've already kind of started a story, I'd love to hear in the comments below which decision you decided to go with. I've got several stories, so I'm only talking about the fantasy novel here at this point, but we'll get into some of the other ones in the future. All right, good luck with your writing and world building. See you soon.